No, be quiet. There is not one jot of evidence for God.
The fact that at the heart of biology is the longest word we've ever discovered, the genetic code, is again consistent that this universe is a word-based universe. In the beginning was the Word. All things were made by him. So I see evidence of rational intelligence all over science. But I see that the alternative worldview, atheism, undermines that, although it perceives the very same rational intelligence. And so as explanatory power at that level, but you see, I did say Christianity is not merely a philosophy. And if Jesus Christ really rose from the dead, then that opens up huge possibilities of personal encounter in my life now. And the major reason why I believe that Christianity is true is because Christianity is testable.
Oh, nonsense. How can it be tested?
Well, Peter, let me face that head on. Christ said when he was on earth.
But go ahead.
Christ said that if a person considered the evidence and came to believe that he was God incarnate, who was dying on a cross to give forgiveness and bring peace with God, well, we can test that. I've tested it, and I've seen hundreds of people test it. I mean, take an example. I was lecturing at Harvard a while ago to a couple of thousand people, and when I'd finished, a young Chinese student stood up and he said, "Look at me." So we looked at him, and I said, "Why should we look at you?" He was absolutely beaming. He said, "You should look at me because 6 months ago I came to a lecture you gave at Penn State University. I was at the end. My life was in a complete mess. And something you said triggered a search. And I started to read the New Testament for myself, and I became a Christian. And just look at me now." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've seen that happen not once, not twice, dozens of times. And when you see addiction to drugs transformed into food on the table, when you see broken relationships mended, and you ask people, what happened to you? And they say variously, I became a Christian, I had an encounter with Christ. You begin to put 2 and 2 together and make 4. And I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe that these promises that Jesus made actually can be fulfilled in a person's life today. And that's immensely important to me, the testability of Christian relationship with God.
Well, it's a kind of testability that you should leave to the psychologists and the psychiatrists, I think.
But I don't mind the psychiatrists. What do you mean, leave it to them?
Well, because they will understand why these people have found the comfort. Let's accept that it may be comfort.
But that doesn't prove it's wrong, Peter, to use your argument. The fact that Christianity brings comfort is not evidence against it. It may well be evidence for it. If it brought discomfort and ruined people's lives...
it's brought a great deal of discomfort. Ask Joan of Arc, for example.
You're raising another question, and I'm Irish. I'm very sensitive to that question. And I could go into it if you want to.
I don't need an agent behind it, unless that agent is infinitely indolent, is infinitely anarchic, or is infinitely ignorant, which I don't think you would ascribe those qualities to your God. So I don't need a God to account for this world.
We obviously don't have time to go into the fullness of what you wrote in that book, but the phrase that really struck me from the book was, you said on a few occasions, nothing rolled over into something. That was the way in which the universe, which is clearly something, came from nothing. Now, this was referenced by you earlier, John.
Well, it sounds like nonsense to me. And you know, Peter, what do you mean by nothing in that context?
I mean the absence of space-time.
Or do you mean what most of us mean, the absence of anything?
That's what I mean what I said.
Okay, right. Well, I'm very interested in nothing. In fact, I give lectures on nothing these days.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to enter a discussion like this, and I was surrounded by the experts, probably the world's most famous cosmologist, and I did something I never usually do. I said I'd like to ask the first question. So I said, Alan, look, there's out there there's much ado about nothing. And I want to ask you a question. When you, as a cosmologist, use the word nothing, do you mean what all the rest of us mean as absence of anything? He said, no, we do not.
Well, he was wrong. He should. Because presumably, if there was a creation, let's try to talk in your kind of language. If there was a creation, then presumably the something that we now experience was preceded by the absence of something. And I presume that we can call the absence of something nothing. So presumably at the creation, somehow or other, absolutely nothing changed into something. Is that what
by
happened?
Principles of indolence and ignorance and...
No, those come later.
Oh, I see. I need to read this, you see, Peter. I'm sorry, you catch me out.
But I think...
let me speak to the point.
Let me just finish. So presumably you think that if there was absolutely nothing and it turned into absolutely something, that there was an agent involved in causing that. Is that the creation?
I wouldn't quite put it that way.
I
would say that the universe comes from nothing physical, but it doesn't come from nothing. God is not nothing. In fact, we get the whole thing upside down. We tend to think, partly because of the way we're educated in terms of science, that mass energy and material is the basic stuff of the universe. Of course, now we've come down to nothing being the basic stuff. I would want to say about that is, I don't believe it. But secondly, God is not physical. God is spirit. And the fundamental stuff in the universe is mind and spirit. It's not material. So then, if I could finish, the universe comes from nothing physical. But it doesn't come from nothing. It comes from God who created it. Let there be light, and there was light. And so that is my position.
And that's not a position which you believe conflicts with the science we do know of, the Big Bang?
Not at all. The Big Bang is wonderful because it simply tells us there was a beginning. And science caught up with the Bible in the 1960s. Because science was tied to Aristotle for centuries, believing that there was an eternal universe. Now we believe in a beginning. Whether you mean a beginning of the multiverse or the universe, it doesn't really matter, because the latest mathematical theorems by Guth, the man I just mentioned, Vilenkin and Borde, say that there is an absolute beginning. So the Bible has said it for centuries.
Now, I think you're willing to grant this idea of an absolute beginning, Peter, but for you...
Cautiously.
Cautiously.
I mean, it could be that time is circular, and that we're just seeing a few billion years and it looks straight. But I'm prepared to accept that there might well have been a beginning.
But your view is that prior, well, if you can speak of being prior to, that there was nothing and the something came from nothing. Obviously, many people will say that sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Well, since we've got something and originally there was nothing, then I think it must be true that nothing turned into something. But what you've got to be very careful about is...
It's not a question of nothing turning into something. But what I would like to say is, in my examination of what people believe nothing is, there's Stephen Hawking, there's Lawrence Krauss, and having read all of their books, I discover that the way they get something from nothing, now I'm not saying you're doing it, Peter, because I need to investigate your book, but is by redefining nothing, which is a very clever cop-out. Lawrence Krauss, on about page 5 of his book, A Universe from Nothing, says this: because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. Well, that's sheer nonsense.
Yeah, I think that's nonsense.
Oh, that's great.
Well, we've got some agreement.
Oh, that's very good.
In the dialogue above, the speakers debate whether there is any credible evidence for God, whether Christianity can be meaningfully tested, and whether the universe can genuinely arise from nothing. And I find the rejection of these questions to rely on a selectively constrained notion of evidence. This section marks a decisive shift in the debate. The conversation moves away from abstract boundaries of explanation and confronts the concrete issue of evidence itself. The repeated claim that there is not one jot of evidence for God is rhetorically forceful, but philosophically underdeveloped. It raises an unavoidable preliminary question. What is meant by evidence, and who is allowed to define it? If evidence is restricted exclusively to what can be measured by physical instruments, then vast domains of rational inquiry are excluded by definition. Mathematical truths, logical principles, historical conclusions, and even the intelligibility of science itself would fall outside that narrow boundary. Yet no one conducts science as if these domains are illegitimate. Science presupposes logic, relies on mathematics, and assumes that the universe is rationally ordered. None of these assumptions are proven by experiment. They are the conditions that make experiment possible. John Lennox's response does not attempt to smuggle God into the gaps of scientific ignorance. Instead, he directs attention to something far more fundamental, the rational structure of reality. The universe is not merely observable. It is intelligible. It can be described mathematically, investigated systematically, and understood conceptually. This intelligibility is not a discovery of science. It is a prerequisite for science. Every experiment assumes that reality is governed by consistent principles accessible to the human mind. The irony Lennox highlights is subtle but powerful. Atheistic naturalism relies upon rationality while struggling to explain why rationality should exist at all. If the universe is ultimately the product of blind, purposeless processes, then reason itself becomes a fortunate accident. Yet science depends on trusting reason precisely because it corresponds to reality. The data are shared. The divergence lies in how that data is interpreted at the deepest level. The discussion then turns to the notion of testability, a concept often invoked but rarely examined. Lennox insists that Christianity is not merely a philosophical worldview, but a historical and relational claim. It asserts that specific events occurred in history and that those events have present implications. Historical claims are not tested in laboratories, but neither are they dismissed as meaningless. Courts of law, academic historians, and investigative journalists all operate within a framework of cumulative evidence, inference, and explanatory coherence. Beyond history, Lennox introduces a more controversial form of evidence, lived transformation. He recounts instances of individuals whose lives were radically altered after embracing Christian belief, addictions broken, relationships restored, despair replaced with purpose. These accounts are often dismissed as subjective, yet this dismissal itself requires justification. In medicine, psychology, and social science, repeated and convergent experiences are taken seriously as data. They may not constitute proof in a deductive sense, but they are not irrelevant. The objection raised is that such transformations can be explained psychologically. But this response subtly changes the question. To explain the psychological mechanism by which belief affects behavior is not to determine whether the belief is false. Explaining how something works does not explain it away. If comfort disqualifies belief, then despair would have to be treated as a mark of truth. Such a criterion is neither scientific nor coherent. Moreover, this objection applies selectively. No one dismisses moral conviction, aesthetic experience, or even scientific curiosity on the grounds that they have psychological correlates. The presence of a psychological dimension does not negate the possibility that something real is being encountered. To assume otherwise is to beg the question. As this section develops, a pattern becomes increasingly clear. Evidence is welcomed when it aligns with a preferred conclusion and reclassified as irrelevant when it does not. Rational order is celebrated in science but denied explanatory significance. Personal experience is accepted in every domain except religion. These asymmetries are not the result of scientific necessity. They reflect a prior commitment about what kinds of explanations are permissible. The debate then broadens from human experience to cosmic origins, where the question of nothing becomes central. Lennox identifies a critical equivocation that often goes unnoticed. In popular scientific discourse, nothing frequently refers to a quantum vacuum, a set of physical laws, or a fluctuating field. This is not nothing as ordinarily understood. It is something structured, law-governed, and describable. To redefine nothing so that it can produce something is not an explanation. It is a linguistic maneuver. The original question remains unanswered. Why do these laws exist? Why does the vacuum have the properties it does? Redefinition postpones the problem without resolving it. At this point, the debate is no longer about gaps in scientific knowledge. It is about explanatory depth. Saying that the universe comes from nothing only makes sense if nothing has been redefined into something. Lennox's claim is conceptually modest. The universe may come from nothing physical, but it does not come from nothing. That distinction matters. The cosmological discussion sharpens the issue of evidence by exposing how easily definitions can be adjusted to avoid uncomfortable conclusions. When nothing is described as a quantum vacuum or a seething field governed by laws, the word has already been emptied of its ordinary meaning. Such a move does not solve the problem of origins. It merely relocates it. The question is not whether complex states can arise from simpler states, but why there is a framework of states and laws at all. Lennox's insistence on conceptual clarity is therefore not pedantic. It is essential. If nothing truly means the absence of anything, no space, no time, no energy, no laws, then the emergence of something demands an explanation of a fundamentally different kind. To say that nothing turned into something while quietly importing laws into nothing is to answer the question by changing the subject. This is where the appeal to a beginning becomes significant. Modern cosmology, whatever model one prefers, points toward an origin, whether of our universe or of any proposed multiverse. The precise mechanism remains debated, but the existence of a beginning is no longer a theological relic. It is a scientific insight. And a beginning, by definition, invites the question of cause. Science can describe the earliest moments. It cannot explain why those moments exist rather than not. Lennox's proposal, that the universe comes from mind rather than matter, is not a retreat from science, but an attempt to ground it. Minds generate information, intentions, and rational order. Matter, left to itself, does not explain why the universe is comprehensible in the first place. To posit mind at the foundation of reality is not to abandon explanation, but to extend it to a level adequate to the phenomena we observe. The charge that such an explanation is lazy misunderstands explanatory hierarchy. Invoking agency is not a shortcut when agency is precisely what accounts for information-rich, law-governed reality. In every other domain, history, archaeology, criminal investigation, we infer agency as the best explanation of certain patterns. To prohibit that inference only at the cosmic level is not methodological caution. It is selective exclusion. This selective exclusion becomes clearer when we consider how evidential standards are applied. Lived transformation is dismissed as subjective, while abstract models are treated as authoritative. Rational order is celebrated in equations, but denied metaphysical significance. Nothing is allowed to be something, while God is denied any explanatory standing. These moves do not arise from data. They arise from a prior decision about what reality is allowed to contain. What Lennox offers instead is a cumulative case. No single strand, rational intelligibility, historical testimony, personal transformation, cosmic origin, forces assent on its own, but together they form a coherent explanatory framework. Rejecting that framework is possible, but not without cost. One must either narrow the definition of evidence until it excludes much of human knowledge, or accept that some features of reality point beyond impersonal mechanism. The deeper question, then, is not whether God explains everything, but whether a worldview that excludes God can adequately explain anything at the deepest level. Science functions brilliantly within the universe. It maps regularities, uncovers mechanisms, and expands human understanding. But it presupposes rationality, order, and existence itself. Those presuppositions demand explanation, not dismissal. By the end of this section, the debate has moved beyond slogans. The issue is no longer whether belief in God is comforting or culturally conditioned, but whether reality is ultimately intelligible without reference to mind. Lennox does not claim to coerce belief. He claims only that the evidence taken seriously and without redefinition points toward a reality richer than materialism allows.